Thank you everyone again for joining us today. This is the IATI Humanitarian Guidance Consultation. This is the second webinar that we are running today. I'm Peter Kangalva and I'll be presenting together with my colleague Amy Silcock. And we also have, similar to the previous webinar, we'll have Mark Bruff, who would give us a bit on the kind of data use side and a bit of the statistics. So thanks as well to Mark for joining us today. So we'll start first with the agenda for today. And Amy's sharing the slides. Thanks a lot, Amy. So what we plan on doing today, again, it's an hour-and-a-half webinar that we're running with everyone, and we're recording the session just so that everyone's aware, so people are able to listen to it later on. But what we plan on doing today is going through a bit, starting with a bit on the process of this guidance consultation. We had very useful feedback as well from the first webinar. So that's the first thing that I'll start with. Then we'll go again through the overall feedback that we have received so far from some of you who have shared their feedback on the draft guidance, and a bit of recap from the first webinar, especially for those of you who might not, were not able to join us. And then the focus for today would be on the specific topics that you see on the agenda. So the kind of second bit of the guidance that we'll run through, the feedback received, and have some guiding questions. And then at the end, what we want to do is maybe split into some discussion groups and focus on those specific topics so we can have a bit more of a conversation. And then last but not least, we'll talk about next steps. And I think specifically with this guidance process, that would be really good to get your feedback on how we can proceed with this specific guidance. So moving on to the first agenda item. So this is one where I just wanted to run through the process for this consultation and what we can improve on, and kind of thinking of next steps. And we'll have a bit of time at the end just to walk through this. So this just shows you the steps that we've undertaken so far, specifically for the guidance, for the humanitarian guidance. So the first step was obviously on the IATI website. There was a lot of like guidance and reference for specific elements. So what we did was compile this existing guidance that was in multiple places. So we put that into one document, and that's the document that was shared with everyone as the draft guidance for people to feed back via a feedback form. Thanks again to everyone who participated already in this. So this was the second step that already took place. And then what we are now is this third step on discussions with the community via webinar. So we had the first one on the first part of the guidance with some of the topics, and the second one that you are now part of and having a discussion now, so feeding into that. So what we want to look into next is kind of how this feedback is incorporated. So obviously, with the discussions through the webinars and the feedback forms, we've gathered views and from users that are already part of the consultation. But what came out, and I think as feedback as well from the last webinar, is that there were some specific topics that I think we'll discuss today as well that do require further discussion. And I think it would be great to have wider participation from organizations. And one of the options that we do want to get your views as well at the end of this webinar is kind of what is the best format, again, in addition to the webinars that we've run already, to continue this and be able to really have this detailed discussions on those specific topics, but also bring more specific examples. So in IATI at the moment, there are two in terms of mechanisms and possible options. Communities of practice is something that was proposed, and communities of practice will be trialed and launched at the end of November. So one of the suggestions is to see if there's interest in people from this webinar, but the wider humanitarian community to get involved in that. And then working groups are a lot more of a formal process that needs to be, initiated and for advice for members and governing boards. It's more structured process. So we would want to hear your views on kind of how you would want to participate if we are to set these communities of practice. practice. And then the final step would be a bit more clarity on this. And we'll have a bit of time at the end of the webinar to get your views on this, because we really want to make sure we incorporate all the feedback from the humanitarian community on next steps. So moving on to our next slide, Amy, and I'll hand over to Amy to just go into the specific discussions on the guidance and the feedback received so far.
Thank you, Petra. So yeah, recapping on the feedback we've received so far on the kind of draft humanitarian guidance documentation, there was clear feedback that actually having easy to read guidance with instructions on how to code up your activities all in the same place, using all of the different elements and functionality within the standard was really helpful. Things to kind of add further into that is more XML examples, more of those case studies, so to see it working in practice. And two of the big kind of questions that came up was, one was how to identify partially humanitarian activities. And we spent quite a bit of time in our last webinar looking at this issue, and feel free to go back and watch the recording if you weren't able to attend. And this is particularly an area that we would like to move forwards, whether that's community of practice, a working group. The logistics of that is still to be arranged, but this kind of ongoing consultation, and also picking up some of the other areas that we would like to explore in more detail. So this webinar that we want to kind of focus on is touch upon the categorization of organizations, having a discussion about that. There was also a question that came up about, is the guidance kind of looking at the triple nexus? So the nexus of humanitarian development and peace building activities. And this is not something that we have particularly addressed so far in the draft guidance, but can certainly work into future conversations. And I know that this this topic is coming up more and more, and it's coming up too with the kind of the UNCB requirement reporting, and that kind of three-way split of what different activities can be like. So yeah, we are open to future conversations, but we do recognise that this current guidance doesn't address the peace building nature of some activities. The other area that the question that keeps coming up is, does IATI have a definition of what is humanitarian? So this is one that we've been thinking about and asking, various different people questions on. And, we're beginning to think that actually each organization will often have their own version or their own description or classification for a humanitarian activity. And as IATI, we can't mandate what is humanitarian and what is not. So it's very much free and up to organizations to be able to do their own classification. However, what might be helpful is if we could add a description into our guidance for those organizations that don't already have a way of classifying humanitarian activities, as a beginning of a guide. So we will have a go at drafting that and adding that into the guidance, which we will share with you after these webinars. So Petra, onto a brief recap from webinar 1.
Thank you, Amy. So yeah, just for some of you, I know some of you have already joined the first webinar, but in the first part, as you know, the guidance is quite detailed. So what we focused on is 4 specific areas. So one was about the humanitarian flag. And I think a lot of the discussions were around levels of reporting. So whether it's an activity and transaction level, and how the discussions about the current definition, and what we found, at least from some of the organizations joining, was about the definition of the flag, of using it as a wholly or partially humanitarian activities. So yeah, we discussed some of the challenges. Again, I think what came out of this discussion is that people did want to have, a working group or a community of practice where they can really engage in that consultation. And what was really good to see is that there was a debate about the recommendation between activity and transaction level. I think some people were quite, against really having this as a recommendation at transaction level. But so I think for us, that was really useful to hear and to see this discussion, and it really kind of explained, I think, the need from the community to have this more in-depth discussion. And this is what I very much started at the beginning. The other topics that were discussed was, again, the use of the sector, the OECD DAC codes that were specific to for humanitarian activities. And again, I think we heard from some organizations, and there were mixed views in terms of how those are used. For some organizations, they were already using them because it's part of their DAC reporting, but there was no specific, clear match between using the flag and the DAC sector codes. And again, I think for some organizations, there were also the discussions around if you want to report more granular, to kind of allocate percentages using sector codes rather than using the flag at transaction level. So it was a really useful kind of beginning of this conversation that I think we do need to bring more people on board to continue the discussion and see in what scenarios, what would be a better use case. We talked about as well the glide. So this is talking about humanitarian scope in the guidance, about the glide and humanitarian response plans and how those are used. Similar discussions again at kind of level of reporting, which was again useful to see that for some, it would be really useful if in future upgrades, organizations are able to report the transaction level, but a lot of people are also against this. So, so that's another useful discussion to continue on. Discussing humanitarian budgets. So that was very much a discussion about rapid onset emergencies. And we were very brief on this and kind of really needing more examples from organizations to say in what scenarios they might not be able to provide or use the budget not provided attribute. So I think on all those areas, it was really useful to start the conversation, but it was a recognition that we do need more examples from organizations to really be able to draw from those and be able to give better advice through the guidance. So I hope that was useful. That's a bit of a recap of kind of some of the discussion. And in summary, I think there needs to be definitely more involvement from people on all those topics. And we'll move on, I think, next to Amy, to you to go in detail on those specific topics that we plan on discussing today.
Yeah, so the first topic is looking at identifying local actors. This, so the feedback that we got from you guys is that the guidance in the draft document is good, but the current code list is not. So if you are aware of the way that IATI runs its code list, is that they can only be upgraded during upgrades. And we are left with a mixture of using the DAC codes for organization type, as well as at a more recent upgrade, we've added in a number of kind of the localization, grand bargain organization types. So these are much more like the kind of regional NGOs and partner country NGOs. And there is a bit of a disparity between those two codes, the two sources of the codes holding together. So this is causing the confusion. So comments back is that actually we need to find a mapping, not only between the DAC codes and then the grand bargain codes, but also between our IATI code list and the UN contributor types, certainly for the UN agencies. And there is also a confusion between what is a national NGO and what is a partner country based NGO. And this is something that we'd like to kind of be able to pick out with you in the discussion coming up at the end. We also asked you about what are the challenges as organizations you are finding of being able to identify local actors in your publishing. And so some of the challenges came back that actually this isn't currently data that you are capturing, or that is that data that you're only using for your grand bargain purposes. And that means manually adding in these classifications into your systems. There's also the issue of a number of local partners are redacted for security reasons. And if they can't be named, and therefore how do we begin to classify them? There's also just a general confusion about which code should I be using and when should I be using, how should I be categorizing myself? Does it depend at what kind of part in the funding chain I am? So we want to pick these up in a bit more detail. And Mark has done a bit of analysis in terms of what is currently being used within the IATI standard.
Thanks, Amy. Yeah, so in the last webinar, we presented some more analysis, mostly using the COVID-19 prototype visualization. In this webinar, most of the examples are from IATI data in general, because there's much less data available for the various different things that we're discussing in this webinar. In the COVID-19 prototype visualizations, there are all COVID-19 activities. The only organization that's using the organization type 24, so partner country-based NGO, is Oxfam Novib. And I think that's for about 45 activities, I think. Yes, for 45 activities. Otherwise, though, there are quite a lot of organizations that are using this new organization type 24, and there's 61 publishers that are somehow referring to either receiver organizations or implementing organizations of their activities that are partner country-based NGOs, and all but 3 of those are NGOs.
Cheers, thank you, Mark. So up on the screen, you can currently see how the IATI code list looks. So we can say that we've got the description for the partner country-based NGOs. And what we can't do until the next upgrade, until a major upgrade is added, a description for codes 21 to 23. That is beyond the scope of what we're allowed to do. So what we are wanting to do in this interim phase is work out, can we produce guidance about how these codes should be used and how they should be interpreted? It can't be a hard and fast rule, but we can certainly offer guidance. So we will have a discussion time at the end of the webinar. And what we want to do is imagine you are ActionAid. And so with ActionAid, we have ActionAid International. We also have ActionAid Rwanda. And so they are a country base for that organization. And they're also working with local unnamed partners. And what we want to discussion is, how should they be coded in terms of organization type? How do they work together? And if we can come up with some examples of what partner country-based NGOs are, so that's code 24, we would love to hear from you. So moving on to the next section is the humanitarian cluster codes. And the feedback that we received is there's a whole amount of debate about how these cluster codes should be used. So this is aligning to the different UN type clusters, so whether it's WASH, whether it's in humanitarian disaster. And there are a number of different organizations who are deliberately working within the UN cluster codes. However, there are a number of different other organizations working in humanitarian responses, which are doing so outside of these cluster codes. And the question that is up for debate is, if you're working outside of these cluster codes, should you begin to align your activities to the cluster codes in your IATI publishing? And we had a great deal of kind of yes and no responses to this question. An example of the yeses is actually it allows users to find additional related activities if they're looking for particular organizations working in a humanitarian disaster within a particular area. And it may also help UNOCHA with their own data use. On the flip side of this is that, should organizations actually be publishing what they're not doing? Can we not get this information from the OECD DAC sector codes? And does this begin to provide a distorted view of what is happening in the humanitarian landscape? So there are definitely pros and cons to this. So this is one that we would just really like to pick your brains on, and going, what do you see as the advantages of everyone aligning to the cluster codes within the IATI publishing, compared to actually, no, it should only be organizations who are actually working within the cluster codes who are using them. And Mark, over to you.
Yeah, so in this case, thanks, Amy. In this case, there's only 14 publishers who are currently using humanitarian cluster codes. Compared with the other issues that we're about to discuss, it's quite sort of reasonably fairly distributed between governments, multilaterals, and NGOs. But then you can see they're obviously not being particularly well used at the moment. There's only 14 publishers.
Thanks, Mark. So yeah, we'll come on to this discussion towards the end of the webinar. Moving on to aid types and Petra, over to you.
Great, thanks a lot, Amy. And we hope we'll definitely repeat before we go into discussion on all those specific topics. So the next question in the guidance was related to aid type. So under aid type, there are two specific what we call vocabularies and categories that organizations can use. And I'll start first with the earmarking, and then we'll talk about cash and voucher. So some of the questions that we posed and we wanted to understand better by raising those questions to the communities, how those are used. So one of the questions was about whether you agree that earmarking categories or modalities should be used at a transaction level. So this is another question about the granularity. So at what level would you be able to report this? And in the next slide, I'll share again what those earmarking categories are. We had a few responses, as we've mentioned in the first webinar. We probably had around 10 people who responded to the form. And again, very mixed responses. That's why I think we do need a much wider discussion on this. But I think some of the points mentioned was that actually quite a few organizations report this at the activity level. And it was interesting to hear that mentions that some earmarking decisions are made at contracting stage. So then that means it's valid for all transactions. So we really want to hear from you and how that works within your organizations, like specifically in relation to earmarking. So I think the initial feedback that we received was very much more towards the activity level, and like having to specify that a transaction would make it a bit more complicated. So again, will be really, really good to hear on this. And I'll hand over, briefly again to Mark on this, as I think with those topics, there's still limited published information, and that's why I think it's really good to have your contributions on the discussions and the recommendations. So I'll briefly hand over to you, Mark, on the 9 publishers.
Thanks, Petia. So again, there's not that much data currently published here. There's 9 publishers declaring earmarking, 2 of whom are publishing at the activity level, and then 7 at the transaction level. And this is a mix of categories and modalities. So ActionAid UK, for example, is publishing both category and modality. Netherlands is only publishing category, I think. Whereas UNHCR is also publishing both, and again at the transaction level. So it's a bit of a mixed picture here again, but generally there's also not a lot of data available.
Mm-hmm. Thanks a lot, Mark, on this one. Moving on, to the next slide. So this is exactly what we're talking about. So we're talking about the categories, which you can see on the slide. So unearmarked, softly earmarked, earmarked, tightly earmarked. And then the modalities is basically a separate code list that looks at those kind of subcodes for each one of those categories. So one of the questions we wanted to understand is how those are currently used. So whether organizations, will be able to use both, or so the category of vocabulary, I think that is in the slide. And again, I think no strong opinions of, at what level organizations are able to report, if they're able to do at the modality level, that's left to the publisher to decide. I think one of the comments was also about even the categories as they are can be open to interpretation. So I think that's another question that would be good to hear from you on how you're using them, the decisions about, when an activity is earmarked, or how those are made within your organizations, and what will be useful to add to the guidance. But as Mark said, I think still specifically on this, it's more of limited data available. And yeah, it's again a topic will be great to hear more from people. And then moving on to the next slide, Amy. So under a type, and that was more recently added, recently as in just over a year or so, it's about declaring cash and voucher contribution. And I think for those of you that, are involved in the humanitarian field, know that there has been quite a lot of encouragement as well in terms of, ways of like funding and kind of more in the form of cash and voucher contributions. So what we were trying to understand better and to see whether we can add as an additional guidance is whether those codes like cash and voucher will be allocated to disbursement and expenditure transactions, because obviously they're further down the chain. So we wanted to understand internally how you would use those. The responses we got so far was, yeah, it depends where in the funding chain you are. Some mentioned that they can be used for disbursement, dispersing to a specific recipient. But then there were again examples saying, we won't be like reporting a disbursement as a voucher because that's not how it works. So definitely further discussion is needed on this specific topic, and it's just more sharing, learning, and understanding how within your organization that funding models work, and how that would then be mapped into IATI and the specific transactions. And then some of the questions we're trying to understand whether how organizations would use the code list. So obviously there are two separate ones, so cash and voucher. So some of the responses were that it's easy to disaggregate between the two. And for instance, if it is at a transaction level, because you can only use one of the code lists, there was some mention that you wouldn't have a transaction that's a combination of both. But again, we've had limited responses, so those are exactly the questions we want to understand better and be able to add guidance to this. And again, a very brief, I think, note from Mark on who is currently using the cash and voucher code list.
Yeah, so again, here there's very limited data currently available. There are 10 publishers declaring cash and vouchers. It's a mix for the activity level and 6 at transaction level. It looks like ActionAid UK, I think, is publishing both at activity and transaction, maybe depending on different activities. All of the publishers currently are NGOs as well. And it looks like in some cases, rather smaller NGOs as well, with the exception of ActionAid UK, Danish Refugee Council, and Oxfam Novib.
Thanks a lot, Mark. Yeah, so again, a very few examples on this. So on the A type, the discussion questions that I just talked briefly about, but that we want to, when we break into groups, that we can talk about is exactly about how are you currently publishing or plan on doing that, at which level, whether activity or transaction, which level of the earmarking, you will be publishing, the category or modality, and just thinking as well of examples. That's something that we don't currently have in the guidance. And a similar about cash and voucher, for which transaction types you will be publishing or not. And I think that is actually our presentation. I think for this webinar is a lot shorter because I think the discussions, it's obviously topics where I think we don't have so many organizations yet publishing, but that's why it will be really useful to get your views. I think before we go into breakout groups, I think maybe I'll just see if people have any burning questions before we go into splitting into groups. and maybe Amy, you can introduce that that session on the breakouts. But do people have any questions so far? Anything on the process, and just before we go into more in-depth discussions? Yes, Michelle, I can see you've raised your hand.
Yeah, I was just wondering if there's anyone on this call who was a part of the grand bargain discussions when they came up with these earmarking modalities that put and then the earmarking levels and then the modalities in the schedule, the Annex A, if you're familiar with grand bargain. I'm just wondering if there's anyone out here that knows that, because the biggest problem we have is that things don't line up with accounting and how accounting would work. So we don't account for any of this stuff the way that the grand bargain was put together. But while IOM was a part of the grand bargain, I personally was not, and none of our accounting team was. So I'm just trying to find out if anyone out there knows why we came up with what we came up with, because it's handcuffing us for sure. And no one seems to be raising their hand saying, me, I did it. I don't know. So, and I don't know if maybe that's not a problem. I've got to imagine other people. I mean, for instance, there's only one place where in-kind contribution is listed, and it says it's tightly earmarked, but I might have softly earmarked in-kind contributions, but there's no place for me to put in-kind contributions anywhere. So, I'm just wondering if anyone else has looked at that well enough to know that it's handcuffing them or not, or if
Michelle, I was not involved in the actual development of these earmarking discussions, but I know that it's a part of the grand bargain, especially meant for monitoring donor behavior. Because one of the agreements in the grand bargain was that donors should give as much money as possible, which is not earmarked, so that the parties using that money, who have the knowledge and expertise how to use it correctly, can use it as effectively as possible. And I think this is the major reason for earmarking. And the question is whether or not you need this very detailed, low grain levels of earmarking, or that the higher level is good enough, or maybe even you could use the level of earmarking as now is defined by the OECD DAC. And yeah, I think it's good to look at the earmarking discussion with regards to why it's there in a grand bargain.
Yeah, and I understand the part, I guess, I understand why we have to look at earmarking modalities, but if you look at it, I'm trying to find the code list, my apologies, I'm trying to remember what element we're even talking about here, but aid type, we've essentially said that unearmarked funding, like the second category, fully flexible core funding contributing to SURF, core contributions, is all considered unearmarked. But then you get down to other categories and none of them can be unearmarked. And I'm like, well, some of them might be. So the problem is we've connected at the hip 4 categories of earmarking against A through L categories of modalities when the combinations might not be that stiff. So it was, to me, it's more like along the x-axis, you should have had the earmarking, and across the y-axis, you had the modalities, and then you had different combinations. But because you have in-kind only as a tightly earmarked, somebody might give us a bunch of tents and they don't care what we use it for, and it might not be in a specific country. And, so it just makes it very hard, because rather than allow it to be any combination of A through L with any combination of unearmarked to tightly earmarked, I end up getting stuck.
And I think that's probably exactly what I was saying, Michelle. We need more discussions, because you're also now talking about how internally you would use them. But I guess 2 questions here of like how they were created, because I know at the creation with the grand bargain, exactly as Herman mentioned, kind of donor behavior. I know that there were discussions as well of like, oh, do they align with the OECD DAC code list, in what way? But I think this is exactly why we need a bit more to, you know, to understand how you use those definitions, because some of the feedback, as I understand, is again slightly more open to.
And I can understand why OECD and these don't line up necessarily, because one is specifically development and one is humanitarian, and there's going to be reasons. And because we're allowed to put more than one, you know, aid type in there or whatever, I think we're okay. It's again, I don't think this is an IATI thing to fix. That's why I was asking if there were grand bargain people here, because these code lists were negotiated amongst the 80 some signers of the agreement. But, you know, with no offense to anyone that might have been a part of the conversation, anyone who is looking at accounting that knows anything about accounting looks at this list and says this was clearly put together by non-accountants. They weren't looking at how you actually capture earmarking. And I'm not even talking IOM, but it's just, I don't know, it's like asking a mechanic why I've got a spark plug and a gallon of gas next to each other. They just don't go together. And these things might make sense to policy people and, you know, high level discussions, but it's not practical for implementation. And that's why I was asking, because the challenge is this list is what it is. And I don't know the way in which, you
that's
know,
a question, I think, good question, Michelle, that I think we do need people who can maybe explain a bit more. And I know, Justin, you had your hand up. I wasn't sure if you wanted to say something before we...
I was actually just going to comment on the, and sorry, Michelle, I actually disagree with you on the in-kind. If you've got tents, they're for shelter. That's a sector that's tightly earmarked.
I made it as an example. That's probably not a good example, but I do know that we have in-kind contributions that don't necessarily fall under tightly earmarked things. But that's just an example of things that for us are sort of, and maybe that's a bad example, but it just seems to me that you could have pooled funds that are softly earmarked or pooled funds that are earmarked or pooled funds that are tightly, you know, to me, there's a little bit of confusion, but and I know I'm not the only one within IOM that has that. I mean, I've talked to our lead accountants and they are struggling, trying to figure out how to make this work in conjunction with UN reporting and in conjunction with OECD. I mean, well, again, we're not worried about OECD, but marrying this up with the same categories that the UN has put together, that they don't really line up because they're inflexible.
That's a question, I think, Michelle, that I think exactly our point. We do need more.
But Justin, correct me if I didn't mean to cut you off there. I just wanted to say that my example was probably not a good one, but I would love to hear how you think this actually works, because if you can figure it out, maybe you can school me on how to make it, to understand it better.
Well, I actually ignore the modality. Is that the modalities that I ignore the letters.
Yeah.
But I think the 4 categories is actually intelligible.
Absolutely.
And it lined up with how UNHCR used to report. So in actual fact, to move to the grand bargain terminology, all we did is tweak a few labels.
Yep.
And then it just started working. So I would, in terms of IATI, I think it would be fine just to use the categories, not the modalities.
Right. And that's my point. Categories are easy enough. Modalities would be easy enough, but lining up the categories and the modalities in this strict A through C only equals 1 and D through F equals 2, that's where we're struggling. It's not that we can't get earmarking, tightly earmarking. That's, although the definition of softly and tightly and just regular earmarked is a little squishy, but I agree with you. The first 4 are very easy to do, or relatively easy to do, but marrying them up with modalities so that we're using both lists is where we're struggling here.
Okay, so based on that, I think maybe if we can encourage within the IATI community to publish on the earmarking categories, because I think it is one of our responsibilities to give greater visibility to donors of flexible funding. And if I can use IATI as one way of doing that, I think it's a good thing. To thank donors such as Sweden who give a lot of flexible funding, yet that funding isn't so visible as tightly earmarked funding because it's difficult to tie down exactly how you're using it. That's my only point, that it'd be good if we encourage the use of this, maybe not the modalities, but maybe put the categories on the on this Grand Bargain dashboard. You know, the one I mean, I've forgotten the name right now.
Yeah, the Hum portal.
What I was thinking to suggest is I can maybe, Michelle and Justin, it seems like you're quite interested in the earmarking, kind of going into, but that's so useful, even just hearing this conversation. But yeah, I think Mark wants to mention something. And then if people are interested, I think it would be good to have this discussions in 3 groups to just go in a bit more detail on those topics, because it seems like it is quite useful. And Amy posted in the chat already, yeah, the 3 topics that we can split into. Did you want to say something, Mark, before we jump into the group and have a bit of a discussion?
Yeah, just a quick question actually to Herman. I think you mentioned something about the OECD DAC now having a some kind of methodology around earmarking, if I didn't misunderstand you. And I know there was some discussion around this before, but I was wondering if you could say a few more words on that, if I've not misunderstood you.
Yeah, there is in the DAC, there was a discussion intimated by OG from Denmark, who especially wanted to have one category, if I'm not mistaken, the B03 category of unearmarked funding, split up into subcategories to make it possible to have a more fine, more low level definition of what you mean by earmarking, so that it better matches with the grand bargain. And that has been adopted by the DAC last year, I think, and it can now be published by all DAC publishers who wish so.
Okay, thank you, Herman. That's great.
And that, I think, that's another reason for sticking to the broad categories, not the detailed definition of levels of earmarking, because, as I think Michelle mentioned very correctly, it's very difficult to use that classification in such a way that you can really compare publishers with each other. It's too fine-grained, and there are too many exceptions.
Unless the standard doesn't require us to follow that only A, B, and C matches 1 and D, E, and F matches 2, if we can code it to 1 and H, if that's applicable, or 3 and A, if that's applicable, as long as the standard's not going to tell us give us the error message. The validations is what I don't know. If it doesn't say, the validation says, well, wait a minute, you can't use modality K with unearmarked, because that's just not a combination that's allowed. It still allows people to be flexible if you have, again, crazy example, Justin, I realize, is, unearmarked in-kind contribution. So if you want to say it's unearmarked and it is in kind, I want to be able to say it's in kind, and I want to be able to say it's unearmarked. As long as I don't get an error message in the validation, that might be okay. But that's what I wasn't sure, how strict we had to follow this schedule, because in its strict sense, it's hard to use.
The problem is that the definition is not belonging to IATI, but it's belonging to the grand bargain.
Exactly.
And so we should go back to the grand bargain if we want it changed.
Yeah, and I don't know how that even happened. That's why I was, again, going back to, I don't know how this stuff came about.
Questions, I think, that we can note down and find the right people. What I would suggest is, I think it will be good to kind of split into groups and then go into.
It would be great to go around each group and just get kind of a summary of what you were discussing and any kind of takeaways from those discussions. So I'll start with my group, as we were group 1, looking at kind of identifying local actors. So we had CEDA, ILO, and USAID on the call. And one of the things we're talking about is maybe the current challenge for those of us on the call was not so much being able to understand the codes and apply them, but challenges within our internal systems. About working out kind of actually what what is relevant to be publishing, or actually should it be more downstream partners who are publishing? The kind of local implementing organizations and identifying them as such, and as well as if we need to be redacting organizations' names for security reasons. Is that, or is that not helpful to also add in that they are local NGOs? Is that still useful even if we don't have their names? It would be a good one to discuss further. Then Mark, on to you and humanitarian clusters, or a representative from your group.
Yeah, so we just had brief discussion about this, and I think the general view was it would be good just to have some kind of decision, I guess, whether these should be used for organizations that are not involved in a cluster or not. The OECD codes are quite granular, and maybe they're kind of granular and detailed enough. There's maybe some interplay between the OECD humanitarian sector codes and the humanitarian flag and the specific kind of clusters. So for example, if you're involved in education and you use the DAC humanitarian sector codes, obviously the humanitarian sector codes don't have a specific code for education. So would it be better just to say that your activity, use one of the existing sector codes for the CRS sector codes for education, and then you use the humanitarian flag? Would this be a good way of basically achieving the same thing? So it speaks a bit to the discussion we had in the last webinar around the humanitarian DAC sector codes and whether they should be used. And yeah, I think basically it just needs a bit more thinking, I think. And it would be good to discuss a bit further, I think.
Mark, may I make one comment? I saw recently in the CRS code list of the DAC that the humanitarian part in the 70,000 series is more detailed than it was in the past. So the DAC is moving towards more detailed humanitarian sector codes. So we might use that movement to propose maybe some more sector codes if that would make it more easy to align IATI with the DAC and fulfill all information needs.
That's a good point, Helen. So I just checked, and indeed there's new codes for basic health and education in emergencies in the 7200 series, 72,000 series, sorry. So that would be a good thing to look into, definitely.
Cheers, thank you, Mark. And Petra, onto your group on aid types.
Maybe I'll start, and I'm sure people can add on. I think really interesting, because that was the one we started in the main group, and really interesting learning in terms of the guidance. So I think we had Herman, Sarah from USAID, Michelle from IOM, and Justin from UNHCR. And I think following up from the initial discussion already about mainly using the category at the moment with earmarking, I think really useful comments as well from Herman about when decisions are made for earmarking. And I think that's something that's decided by the funder. Majority at the moment, reporting at activity level. And I think questions that I think we definitely need to look into more. So I think understanding better the like from the grand bargain and the specific code list and how that will be used, which is something I think we can definitely do and look into. And I think that was mainly it. It's really useful to hear more on the use of the categories rather than at the moment what we initially had in the guidance as this recommendation for modality. And I think what came out from you was interesting, hearing about where decisions are made for this, whether it's, you have donor, implementer, and maybe that's something useful to think about when we write the guidance, where would you find this information? Anything else from anyone from the group would like to add on this one? Or on any of the other feedback topics? I think we're just sharing some of the codes. No. Still have quite a bit of time, and I think to me, and it will be good, to hear from others, but I think what even the kind of brief discussions we had shows is raising, kind of scraping the surface of starting those discussions and maybe raising a bit more questions of, okay, what are the best alternatives and options for those specific topics. But yeah, just 5 minutes if anyone wants to bring anything back on those specific topics before moving into next steps, which will be really good. We'll have a bit of time to hear from you as well on how best to continue this engagement on the guidance.
Katya, could you just go back to the questions that were part of the aid types that we were supposed to answer in our group?
Yeah.
Because I know it was very short.
Yes.
I'm just looking to see what got missed, but.
So we didn't really talk about.
Oh, we didn't talk about cash.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. That I think is only relevant at the transaction level because it's only it's a type of disbursement or expenditure. So that would be my only 2 cents that we didn't talk about that I would add. The other 2 topics, 1 and 2, we covered extensively and probably beat that to death, but it's 3 that it's under probably expenditure, because even if we give it to an ongoing implementing partner, we would probably just give them the funds, and then how they disperse it on, we wouldn't necessarily track. So I think that's why, Mark, you're only seeing data at the lowest level, the final implementers, because Herman wouldn't know if he's giving us money if we end up dispersing it in a form of CBI, and if we're passing it on through a disbursement ourselves, it's only who's ever reporting the expenditure that's really going to have it there. That would be my 2 cents.
It's useful to hear because from the, as I said, limited feedback we've had so far, that was one of the, the question, would you be using disbursement and expenditure? Majority said add expenditure. So I think now we're more and more organizations saying, Winnie, I think Winnie has raised a hand as well. Hi, Winnie.
Sorry. Hey, hi everyone. Mine, just to add on what Amy talked about the identifying local actors and just understanding. I don't know if this is something that has been done, that you'd be able to. How do you trace to an organization that maybe has or a donation that has been given, and yet it has been declared anonymous because of security reasons? That would be something that maybe would be interesting to note. Or how does an organization identify themselves as anonymous, and they have received, but because of maybe security reasons, again, they can't be able to declare some of the things or the projects that they're working on. So, I mean, that would be interesting to just know how that goes, and how do you protect the people, and how do you, at the same time, in protecting the people, how do you open up that information for other people to use?
Yeah, Winnie, I think there's a good question around who which organization is expected to report what. So if you are, for security reasons, having to redact the local implementing partners you're working on, then they may well be the ones kind of doing the cash expenditures. Does that then need to jump up a level? Because you realize that actually, as the organization, we are going to be the last in this chain of reporters. We would never expect kind of our, whether you call them grantees or partners, to be reporting, then I need to be doing the granular level on their behalf. And that will likely change from organization to organization, even project to project, about who should be reporting that granular level of detail.
Yeah. But it is indeed, like, first the definition of having more examples of those local actors like partner country-based NGOs, and then the points you raised, Winnie, about who would they be able to report, the question that Amy mentioned. Any other points before we move on to our next slide, which will talk about next steps and kind of how we follow up from where we got to with the webinars?
I'm trying to find my raised hand, so I'm just going to jump in. I've just shared in the chat a link to the UN data standard reporting, so that if you're looking, for anyone that's not familiar with it, like standard 6 tells you how they want the UN agencies to report, and they define the NGOs, like we have to get down to foundations and educational, and we can't lump it all as one. So to the extent these code lists, and I know when the UN was working, they had, because I can't remember if it was you, Amy, or Petya that attended the meetings here with the UN. I know they talk about lining things up, but this is the actual guidance that's out there. So to the extent you've got standard number 4, which talks about the earmarking modalities, voluntary, core, blah, blah, blah. You've got standard 6 that talks about the actors involved. So these kinds of standards, this is where, you know, IOM and I'm sure UNHCR and any other UN agency is trying to say, what's the common denominator? So it's, you know, not so it's published once and use all of the IATI, but at least we're not mixing a different recipe every time. It's one journal entry hits an accounting string, and that allows us to report all 3 places, whether it's IATI, OCHA, or excuse me, OECD, IAT to the UN and stuff. So, you know, perhaps just for your reference and anyone else that wants to see the other categories and how granular it gets, because we should essentially go to the lowest common denominator. And if someone doesn't need to know the difference between a university and a foundation, then great, don't use it. But by not having it there, we're sort of hamstringing ourselves. So anyway, that's just my 2 cents.
Yeah, that's, you know, and I think the code list, like the organization type, was exactly aligned from the DAC and what was at that time the kind of localization work stream. So that was when a mapping was done, and through, I think 2003 was probably the latest upgrade where the code list was aligned. And I think, yeah, it's an important point, Michelle, and even maybe within more the UN agencies and understanding with the current one how it maps, because obviously any changes to that would require more formal process, but even just mapping in terms of the definitions is, I think, something that's useful. So thanks a lot for sharing that. Okay, shall we move on to the next slide, Amy? So what I wanted to spend a bit of time is just really think about next steps. And I picked up on this at the very start, you know, talking through the process that we went through. So, you know, we shared the draft with people who are interested to feedback. They sent their forms. We probably had around 10 organizations feeding back. And then we had the webinars, which has been really, really good for people to engage. But of course, I think it raises even more questions, which would require further discussion. So one of our suggestions on next steps would be to definitely, you know, get the feedback we got through the webinars, to just do a bit of a summary to update again the community more widely. You know, we've had a draft guidance, we've started an initial discussion, but then the next step would be to think about whether communities of practice specifically for this humanitarian group can be forward. So the communities of practice, I think some of you will be aware that was a proposal that's now in IATI standard operating procedures of kind of 2 mechanisms in which communities can, you know, get involved, either having a kind of formal working group to advise the board or members assembly, or having the communities of practice. And at the moment, our colleagues in the Secretariat are actually working on setting those in place to basically be launched and in place at the end of November with the new platform. So one of the ideas we had is to have interested participants to kind of have a much bigger discussion on just exactly as we started for those specific topics. So maybe pull them out from the guidance, so have a list of those discussion topics where within the communities of practice, more examples can be brought in kind of a bit more detail, because I think even one of those topics that we've just discussed today could, could take a good hour for interested people, those who are relevant to get involved in the discussion. And then obviously following that to really finalize the document and be able to share online. So that's how it will be really good to hear from you on what you think is needed further from, from this consultation. I think compared to others, there's definitely more of a discussion to be had on those topics, and to kind of bring examples to elaborate on the guidance as a next step. So please feel free to.
Yeah. May I comment on that? I think that's very good that there are further discussions and that a wider part of the community is involved, because we are now sitting together with a fairly limited group, and I think it would not be representative for all the community to base our decisions on how the humanitarian guidance should look like on this current group and this consultation. But I do prefer really a working group and not a community of practice. And that's for the very formal reason that the IATI guidance is a formal part of the IATI standard. And since it is a formal part of the IATI standard and will be an integral part of the IATI standard, I think it should have formal decision making. So that means that the results of these discussions should be put forward to the board and eventually to the members' assembly, so that we have it, that it's formally clear that this is the way we are going to work as IATI. And I don't think we can do that with a community of practice, because that has not that status.
I think there are two things, and it would be good to hear from others as well on this, because obviously, and I think Herman, you've already fed back mainly on the process of of guidance and changes to the guidance. And obviously, I think with this one, for instance, in the previous webinar, there were also discussions where if there is a need, for instance, for an upgrade, that's definitely, something that's a separate process. But it's good to hear your views, that your preferences for this more structured way. I think this is obviously a much longer process if like such a working group is being set up. So at the moment, it'll be good to hear from others who are trying to think of first how to bring more people, or at least to start the conversation given the kind of timeline and launch of the communities of practice. And then from then on decide, okay, do you need this like a more managed working group to kind of finalize this going forward? Are there any other views on kind of better, like what you would find as an organization probably most helpful going forward? Discussions. Any other views? Or would people be interested? And I think one of the things you're also considering is it's quite a bit of your time, which is much appreciated, but I think we do need to find what kind of most efficient way in a way to get more views, as we just said. So that's not the final step, because I think we do need further input from people in this discussion. And yeah, just also hearing from you of what is the best way to do that. Any other views? Or if people be interested in this kind of with the setup, because that's definitely coming, the setup of the communities of practice with the new platform, which will be much easier way for people to communicate and engage. No, I think we have Michelle.
Well, I just have a question. So I think if I'm understanding this correctly, essentially the cart is a little bit before the horse, in that at members assembly last year, we talked about setting up these communities of practice and these working groups. We also talked about doing guidance that we're talking about. And because the communities of practice or the working groups, the processes and the tools weren't set up, we went ahead with these consultations as they are, which are sort of a hybrid from the old world to the new world. They're somewhere in between. but essentially everything we're doing on these calls are intended to become a part of the formal working group structure. And however those get structured, that's where we're going to deal with guidance going forward. Is that a fair understanding, or do I have it wrong there?
There are 2 points to it. One is that previously in the guidance consultations we've run, I would say they were a lot more straightforward as well. So it's kind of compiling the guidance on, geographic location and the activities and all that. And I think specifically for the guidance, it's something that, yes, we are moving towards using one of the 2 mechanisms that was set in place. So that's right, that until then we did not have that set in place. But for a working group, I think one of the main things to understand is obviously before, for instance, we had a working group that was set up for the sustainable development goals and the guidance. It was just people from different organizations that volunteered. With the new structure and the formal setup of a working group is very much references to kind of being mandated. So providing advice to governing board and members assembly. So it's slightly more like formalized process for this advice. So I think with the guidance, we need to find the balance of where input is needed through a very formal working group and where there is an additional consultation needed through the communities of practice. But yeah, bottom line, it is indeed kind of the first one that we'll be doing in such a way. So hence opening it as well for discussion. I think Mark had his hand raised as well.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I wanted to also add is that a lot of this guidance has already been through quite a lot of consultation and discussion as well back in 2016. So it's not like there hasn't been a lot of consultation already as well. I think there's kind of a mix of things here. Some of it is kind of more, along the lines of this kind of basically compiling, putting together stuff which already exists and which is not particularly controversial. And I think some of that stuff, it would be good to be able to get that out, as soon as possible. There's a set of other things that are, need more discussion and more thought and possibly some changes and stuff like this. And that obviously will take longer. And I think it would be good to try and separate out those 2 things between the things that can, we can go ahead with now and say, okay, this is the guidance as it currently stands. And we have some guidance, even if it's shorter and more limited to start with. And then there's other bits of guidance that then needs a bit more work and that we can come up with through a working group or community of practice, whatever is most appropriate.
Yeah, so that was one of the kind of suggestions that I had in the next step slide, like to basically put out on a list, and that's something that's I would want to do following those 2 webinars, specifically with all of you who've engaged already as a follow-up, the draft guidance, but to pull out those outstanding questions. And there were, for those of you who've seen the draft, there were specific areas highlighted in yellow that we started consulting on, and there's definitely further discussion. So kind of pulling those out for the next step in terms of continuing the discussion, and then again, whether that's through a communities of practice of working group. Yeah. Anything else people would want to? I think kind of a summary of next steps is basically, I will definitely follow up within next week as a kind of summarizing, like what are the outstanding questions and proposal for how discussion on those can continue. And if there's anything else you would find helpful, please feel free to email us. It's been really useful to hear your views and to engage in conversation, but the guidance is for organizations and for data users to use. So if you do have any other suggestions, please do let us know, because we want to make it as helpful as possible.